All right. Yeah, so you're recording in your sharing machine. Let me test. Could you go to, yeah, this one? Plug that. Oh, yeah. Let's see. Yeah, microphone. I don't see the microphone. Oh, pulse. That's why. Give me a second.
Oh, is that different angle, huh?
I forgot to put this onto it.
There you go.
All right. Now we should be using this microphone.
Okay, so I can just.
Yes, clip onto your shirt, however you like. The other way.
Yeah, the other way around. Yeah.
There we go. All right.
Wow, thank you. This is perfect.
Yep.
Okay, so all I have to do is this.
Yeah, it's recording now, yeah?
Yeah, I think it should be paused now.
Recording on this computer. Yeah, it's recording right now. So you want it recording or do you want to pause it?
Pause it, please. Okay, folks, I think we should almost, it's 9:30, so we should get started. Okay, I think if I was here a couple of weeks ago, just to refresh you, and at that time, we primarily talked about basic science, and some little bit of history, because you didn't need it, but I enjoyed it, so that's why we just talked about it. So, and we talked about, the role of bioelectricity. I'm sure some of you have taken the bioelectricity class, and that was, the role of electricity, ion channels, and the impulse propagation. That's like, if there is anything like soul, it's the pacemaker cell in the sinus node, that's the heart. So, and then we talked about the discovery of electrocardiogram, and we segued a little bit into the early heart surgery, starting from trauma to birth defects, such as the hole in the heart, which was done with the beating heart, basically, because we didn't have quite a way in the 1940s to stop the heart. So, and then I think I misjudged my time, so I had to end a little bit earlier. So this time I make sure that I have enough material, Now today's session is more about technology than about heart, Or actually I can say this is a journey of my career for the last 75 years, I'm 75 and I entered internship residency when I was 25. In the last 50 years, the advances that I have seen are just mind-boggling type of thing. So now people want to say 50s were the great time, it was the peak of America. But this is an article. That time we barely had penicillin. People were still dying of malaria. There was tuberculosis. Okay, so it wasn't that great, And for heart attack, you know what we did? We gave them morphine and put them on bed rest. Okay, and people died, So, and smoking was, prevalent, type thing during the Second World War. What were the soldiers sent? Coca-Cola and a pack of Camels. That was a thing. Memory of the homeland. So it wasn't, but so we've just seen within single lifetime for about 30, 40 years. We have seen intense change in treatment and technology. And a lot of that, until Anna asked me to do this talk, I had no idea that how much we relied on engineering and technology, because we just used it. We were the end users. We had no clue whatsoever as to how much work went behind it. So that was kind of an eye-opener for me because, okay. Now, who is this guy? FDR, right? Okay, and this was the three big people at the Yalta Conference at the end of Second World War: Winston Churchill, Joseph Stalin, and FDR. Now he was a polio victim, as you could see from the wheelchair, and they successfully hid it from the public. They would photograph him from the correct angle. So, but the important part here it is when he went to the Yalta Conference, he was short of breath. And finally, they called a cardiologist. His doctor was an ENT doctor, by the way. Primary doctor was an ear, nose, throat doctor. So they measured his blood pressure. It was 250 over 150. Okay, and you know what was the advice to the leader of the free world? He should take naps in the afternoon, cut back to only 6 camels, and watch the diet. And he was given an old medicine called digitalis, which comes from a plant called foxglove. You may have seen about the foxglove plant in your mom's garden. So that's where it came from. So that was the advice, so that was, so that was the state of the art. Okay, so this is, it just, when I found out that, I said, wow, we've come a long way. Okay, and so now this is, I just made a list of all the technologies that we use. Okay, it's about every new technology that has come, we have used it for heart. No wonder we were able to reduce the incidence of heart disease type of thing. Unlike other specialties, oncology was a little bit behind, another 20 years afterwards, so they're finally catching up. Because, we didn't have a whole lot of handle on immunology, but that's another subject. Okay, so these were all the things, so these were the old ones on the left side, the new ones, like, because until a few years ago, I had no idea what nanotechnology was, until I started, reading more about, and CRISPR was, obviously that was just, it took about 10 years for CRISPR to get finalized, Okay, so it was basically the human ingenuity, curiosity, basic science. So basically, all the advances are due to applied biomedical engineering. Okay, so we're just, grateful to what the engineers did. Now, how many of you are familiar with Framingham study? Ever heard of it? Okay, Framingham study was because when FDR had the heart attack, Truman got the presidency, and soon they realized, yeah, America has a heart attack problem. So there was a longitudinal, and NIH started getting funding. They branched out to the National Heart and Lung Institute, and they funded a long-term epidemiological study in a small town outside Boston called Framingham. Okay, and they started following about 2,500 people, okay, longitudinally. And that's when they discovered the risk factors with smoking, cholesterol. Why cholesterol? Because that was the only thing we could measure. Okay, we didn't have an idea about measuring something called insulin resistance and obesity. That all came in much later. Okay, so but that was the first study, and that study is from 1948 onward, is still going on. People have been followed for 3 generations, their children and grandchildren, and they're collecting, genetic data, and like epigenetics and everything. So it's really, we have to thank the people. And this was done earlier, and that's just on the same tone, in UK, the double-blind studies were first done. So you read about it in every paper, but that's a relatively new thing, for, within last 70 years. So, and now, and then we have learned, type thing. Now, this is something that you might want to think about. Okay, if you have any heart disease family history, this was, finally, we were, measuring cholesterol, but that then I'll have a lot more to say about it afterwards. But this is a new heart disease calculator that was published by a cardiologist from Northwestern. Okay, and here's a link for it. Okay, you can just put your, you can download the app and plug in your numbers. What are your risks for future heart attacks? Okay, and that gives us an idea as to who should we treat and who should not we treat for preventive measures. So we have gone from, just treating after the event versus preventing. So this is something that you might even want to consider, or, tell your mom and dad, if they're in their, 50s or something. And now, finally, we have learned that, yeah, it's not just heart. We're not just part doctors. Heart disease, we finally realized, yep, this is just a complex of diseases involving kidneys and metabolism. So in last few years, finally, they say they've come up with a concept called CKM disease, cardiac, K for kidney, M for metabolism. And various stages have been, like we like to classify things. Stage 1 is just when you're overweight, and then, you have truncal obesity, where we talked about the DEXA scan last time, dysfunctional obesity, impaired glucose tolerance, okay, because, about 40 to 50% of Americans have insulin resistance, or elevated triglyceride level. That's the other type of fat, which occurs right after you eat. If you eat a heavy meal, your triglycerides will go up. Stage 2 is people who have metabolic risk factors type of thing. So, and they're like the early diabetes, okay. And then a little further on, it gets worse with subclinical heart disease, like if you get a more sophisticated test, you can say you're getting, plaques inside your coronaries. And this was mind-boggling, because soldiers who died in Vietnam when their autopsies were done, they had a little called fatty streak inside their coronaries. So the disease started, in your 20s, okay, for those with risk factors, albeit. So this was, an eye-opening thing. So this is basically the data that we collected, so there is a statement from a famous physicist, mathematician, the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics, okay. So collecting data really made a dramatic difference. Okay, now this is something that we talked about Nobel Prize, okay, and Alfred Nobel, later on, had chest pain, and he was prescribed nitroglycerin. Okay, nitroglycerin is an old-fashioned medicine, like smelling salts. You've seen it in old-fashioned detective movies. That's amyl nitrate, which is smelling nitrate, and that comes in a pill called nitroglycerin, and that was used in gunpowder by, and the reason would be that people who are the workers who are working in factories where they manufactured gun, nitrates and explosives, their chest pain was getting better because they were exposed to the gas. And during the weekend when they didn't work, their chest pain came back. Okay, or and then first time people took nitroglycerin, they were getting headache. Okay, so it's one time when men would actually get a headache, type of thing. So and it took about 100 years to figure out how the pill worked. Okay, it was only like sometime in the 90s that people got the prize that nitrous oxide is a volatile cellular messenger signal. Okay, and that was one of the big discoveries as to how it worked. And it's this is not a biochemistry lecture. It will put you and I to sleep. But nitrates have a huge role to play. It not only just works in heart, as far as we are concerned in this class, it dilates your blood vessels. So it works on cyclic GMP and reduces the calcium flux, so that way it dilates the blood vessels. That's how it relieves the chest pain. But it took us a long time, and it also, there's a role of chemicals called prostaglandins. That's why, remember, I talked about that there is when you're born, you have a tube that connects you to your mom. Okay, and if you want it to stay open, you give infusion of prostaglandins, because that way the blood can, it's like a temporarily, at least it can give baby a little time to grow up a little bit, and then you can do the definitive surgery. So sometimes if you're born with blue baby, and if you want the communication to stay open, you give the prostaglandin infusion. So medicines works both ways, type thing. So, okay. And so, escape. Yeah. Now, this may surprise you that people, nitroglycerin was used as a medicine called, sildenafil, which was one of the prostaglandin derivatives. And people this was done to reduce the blood pressure in the pulmonary arteries. Normal pulmonary artery pressure is about 30. And when it was given to lower the pressures, and this study was done in VA, and the phase 2 patient said, well, we're getting erection. And then the company decided there was a lot more money to be made about making, erectile dysfunction drug. Then pulmonary hypertension is relatively rare. It occurs sometimes in women and sometimes occurs in smokers. So it's not that much market. So this was the start, and I'm sure some of you may have seen this movie. Okay, so this was, the role of I talked about the Rogaine, which was used for blood pressure, that it was used for baldness. So the same way, sildenafil, which is generically called, the brand name is Viagra. That's how it was marketed. Okay, but that's the sidekick. Now, we start out with in the early 50s, the first technology that we started using was ultrasound, because during the wars are great for discovery of technology. And the piezoelectric crystal now, was used where the sound beam is done and it's converted to electricity. And I don't know if you can read. Sorry, I should have made this a little different color. My bad. So electric charge accumulates on some material which are crystals, which are ceramics basically, and biological material is bone, that would conduct sound into. That's why you put your headphones on the bone, better conduction. Okay, so the mechanical stress can be converted into electricity. So that's called piezoelectric crystals, and there are varieties of salts and other stuff. So this effect was discovered by Pierre Curie, like in the 19th century, but it took until another 50 years for it to become practical for use for human testing. So it finally, the Swedes started using this, and the combinations are varieties of complex chemistry, which is lead, zirconate, titanium. So it's, I'll upload this on my notes, and then you can read about it. So a lot of it is ceramics that is used, Let's see if I can zone into pictures. And these are the crystals, and it would just convert into electricity. So this was the early days of sound wave technology. In the early days, we just had very limited view, like an ice pick view, just like that, so to speak. So we could just see a little bit more squiggles type of thing. And then usually the Japanese and the Dutch manufacturer Philips advanced that to do the ultrasound. Now, hopefully this will play. Yeah, I don't know if the sound. Okay, piezoelectric sensor is a sensor which uses this effect to change in the pressure and acceleration by converts it to electrical charge, basically. And the Greek word piezo means squeezing. Okay. I think we are recording on Zoom, so the sound may not come through, type of thing. But you get the general idea, basically. So it may not be even sound on this one. Okay. Now, we talked about stethoscope. Every doctor's, who's on TV has a stethoscope around his neck. Okay. And that's actually for all practical purposes with ultrasound. We can even just throw it away, because a portable ultrasound machine at bedside is a lot more valuable, and all the emergency rooms have access to this, and it's not that difficult to learn how to interpret the images. But if you really want stethoscope, this ad was pushed to my YouTube feed, okay, because I was looking at cardiology. The new stethoscopes have an app which not only records heart sounds, but also an electrocardiogram. So all the things that we studied, we can record it directly from this. So it's just mind-blowing as to how impressive that is. And this has been miniaturized enough that you could just take a little probe about the size of, little less than half my size of my phone, and with sound wave, you can record the entire heart movement activity. Now, let me see. Hopefully this will play. Okay, this is a heart with feet on the other side, head is on my side, and you can see the 4 chambers of the heart. The beams come from the top, and this is based on the flow pattern. This is color coded. When the flow comes towards you, it is red. When it goes away, it's blue. Now the transducer is set, so we are imaging the heart along the short axis. So that's why it looks around like a donut. Okay, and this is when it is recorded from the tip, where the heartbeat is, and looking it upside towards the right shoulder. You can see the flow, and you twist it around, you get various views. So this is an amazing technology, and I spent all of my 30 years, looking at these images, and you can really, get a dramatic information on the anatomy and physiology of the heart. So it's really a dramatic advance that has become tool. Now it looks easy because this was a beautiful picture. It's not so easy because people are fat, they come in different shapes, and women have breasts that come in the way. You can't get under the apex. You can't feel the heartbeat. Even if you put your hand and try to. So it becomes difficult, and and people have to hold their breath. So recording it requires a little bit of acquired skill, and even then, the success rate is about 90% at the most. So we come up with this, get behind the heart. It's just like getting behind the Niagara Falls and getting a better feel for it. How do you do that? We advanced the fiber optic, and this was all based on fiber optics advance. We got the idea from the stomach doctors. They were looking at it to diagnose ulcers, okay? But we used the fiber optic scope, advance it toward the esophagus, and record from the backside. So you eliminate the lungs, and you get picture like as if you're miniaturized camera inside the heart. Now this is blind procedure. We can record the sound waves, but you don't know where we are doing. So there is some risk to it. You could puncture the food pipe, and that is a disaster if that happens. So it's called transesophageal echo. Trans means across, esophagus means the food pipe. Okay, so that's and that's really remarkable, this thing. Now these are some of the disease processes. You can see this is normal. This is heart attack when the part does not move. Heart failure when it looks like instead of a football, it looks like a basketball. That's heart failure. The valve stenosis is pretty rare now because we all take penicillin for strep infection. So valve stenosis it does occur in people over my age, when the valve gets calcium. But that's different valve, the aortic valve. And the mitral valve, MVR means mitral valve replacement. Sometimes there is a birth defect. The valve is floppy. Mother Nature does not do a perfect job. The valve is, instead of closing nice and snug, it's floppy. Then it leaks. So that's leaky valve. And then sometimes you can get fluid around the heart, either because of trauma or infection. Okay. So, and this is the hole in the heart airborne. So these are the varieties of diseases that can occur. Now, one other thing, because I stopped working active cardiology for a long time now. So a new way of imaging has been developed, something called photoacoustic imaging. Okay, that's basically a biomedical imaging technique with contrast and optical absorption. Okay, and it's light in, sound out. So that is really a dramatic advance over the recording piezoelectric crystals that we used to have. And I think some of you may know more about it than I do, basically. Uses pulse lasers to generate acoustic waves. It creates a little temperature difference type of thing based on tissues. And so that's a new way of, getting better images. And then again, there are varieties of contrast agents that have been developed, including blood and water. And so this is, again, varieties of dyes that have been developed, So the field has really changed dramatically with advances in laser and nanotech. Okay. Now all of you know the Doppler, so I'm not going to say, but just for the old guys that I talked to, and I'll put in that the Doppler principle is well known, basically. So it's old news type of thing, And this goes down to the earlier, even 19th century thing called Bernoulli principle. So that's basic physics. So you don't need to know. You already know all that. So now this abbreviation, this ICE has nothing to do with the ICE as you know about. Okay, this ICE stands for intracoronary echocardiography. Okay, that's the abbreviation, and intravascular ultrasound. Okay, so this is. Let's hope this plays. Okay. Yeah, I think my sound has. Okay. Yeah, you remember we talked about coronary arteries, which are like 2 millimeters or so. Now, the companies who do the work have devised catheters which can go inside the coronary arteries and record ultrasound. So the sophistication and miniaturization that has taken place is just dramatic. Now, if you watch any regular television, you may have heard about atrial fibrillation, which is when the heart is irregular and becomes chaotic. And that's a common reason for strokes, okay? And like 20% of the strokes are due to blood clot that forms in the heart. And the earlier treatment for almost 60 years was giving blood thinners, okay? But nobody likes taking pills every day. So there is a cure that has been developed. Inside the left side of the heart, there is something called an appendage, which is like a little pouch. It's just like a mini purse that's on the side of the heart called left atrial appendage. And what happens is that is the part, it's just like the blood stagnates, like inside your garbage disposal, So when it stagnates and that gets loose and goes to the brain. So some clever guys thought, what if you put a little umbrella and plug this up? So this is the technology that's what devised, but that's unfortunately, that's on the left side. you can't swim upstream in a high pressure chamber from the artery. Okay, so what do? You come from the right side, make a tiny hole with a needle in the heart, and put in this little umbrella inside the thing. So you have to imagine the engineering of the material science that goes behind it about devising this little umbrella type device and plugging it in. Okay, so that, so that's called intracoronary. And also intravascular ultrasound is just basically probe to get a 360-degree view inside the coronary arteries to get, say, where is the plaque, okay, where is it narrowed, and that helps devise when you're dealing with heart attack victims, to see where the blockage is. Okay, those are the two types of catheters. Now these catheters are frightfully expensive. Some of them cost thousands of dollars. Okay, and that's a monopoly of certain companies. Okay, and if they stop manufacturing those catheters, now you're up the creek, so to speak. So that's it's a dramatic technology. Now so we have beaten the ultrasound to death now. Now remember, heart rhythm can speed up, which is the atrial fibrillation where we shock the heart. Okay, but there's also can slow down, and that's a fascinating story. Okay, that people had thought about stimulating the heart. Okay, in the early days, the Romans used to put electric eel on the head to relieve headaches. Okay, and then it took until 1760 for electricity to come around, and people recorded that. And then somebody thought, oh, well, what about if we use electricity to stimulate heartbeat? And the earlier experiments were done during surgery. People would put electrodes and stimulate the heartbeat. And lo and behold, it worked. So the idea got extended. What if we do it like an outside box? And this was in, and the direct stimulation was done. You can just see it as far back as 1878. And it took another 40, 50 years for people to come up with a device. And this was the earliest pacemaker. You can see how this poor guy is pushing this pacemaker around, okay. And believe it or not, the society was so conservative, they thought this was against God. So people were protesting against this physician physician scientist who came up with this idea, okay. But so and it was a hand cracked, machine basically. So, and the doctor was criticized by the American Medical Association, said, oh, this is against nature. Okay, but obviously, that finally that petered out, the protest. And the battery power was the biggest limitation. And this is right after Manhattan Project. So people had even thought about putting a nuclear powered device. Okay, now imagine walking around with radioactive source inside your heart, for all your life, okay. So, but then with the advent of lithium, it just changed dramatically. Okay. This brings us to a fascinating story, that, these people are using these devices. Now, when they do surgeries on babies, to repair the hole in the heart, the electrical wiring is just very close to between the top and the bottom chamber. So you have a lot more risk that you're going to cause damage to that area, and the heart rate can drop abruptly from 100 to about 40. Okay, so the kid could die on the table. So that's when people were using electrical wires to stimulate the heartbeat. Now, a surgeon named Dr. Lily High was operating in Minneapolis, and there was power failure, and the child died. That's when he got frustrated that this is unacceptable. So he talked to a friendly neighborhood electronics expert, said, can you do something about it? Luckily for him, he had read popular electronics at that time. So with the advent of, transistor batteries, okay, says, yeah, doctor, I'll see what I can do. So he came up with yeah, my slides were out of sequence, okay. So this is, you can see this was the earliest pacemaker, and he timed it with a piano metronome, okay. And that, and then obviously in those days there were no human committee that would review. So, next day when he came in, the surgeon had already used it a couple of weeks later, okay. And that just went on to form a company called Medtronic. And they own 90% of the world market on pacemakers, okay. And Earl Bakken. So that's a very fascinating story about how accidental discovery led to a dramatic advance in cardiology. Okay, so that was, okay. And now, now just to save the taxes, by the way, the company headquarters has moved to Dublin. Okay, so, but that's not our subject. And the evolution of pacemakers, so this is a rather busy side. So this is the early pacemakers you can saw. Then the implantable pacemaker came about. Little box was devised that a surgeon or even a cardiologist puts it under the collarbone. They create like a pocket and insert it. The only thing that goes inside the heart are the two wires. Originally, it was just one wire, okay? But that just didn't beat the proper sequence between top and bottom. It was out of sync, okay? So then we said we should mimic the physiology, so they devised two chambers, okay? Unfortunately, the top chamber is kind of smooth, so you have to devise the material science and the engineering people had to devise a hook that would hook on the left atrial wall. So it was a lot of engineering thought went behind it. Okay, let's see, what's the third one? Oh, sorry. Okay, and then right, so dual chamber pacemakers, to simulate as much physiology as possible. And now those wires had a problem because they developed fractures, and some people used to, some patients would play around with the box, okay, and the wire would get twisted around, and sometimes would break, and that would require a big surgery. So it was the wires can, and also you have to stay on bed rest so it doesn't get dislodged in the first few days. So there are a lot of limitations, that biology, because, and the metal had reactions sometimes, so you have to devise non-allergenic metal. So now things have been devised that are actually, leadless pacemakers. So this is like a little battery, which is about as small as half an inch, just like a USB dongle, and rounded. It's put inside the heart and it generates enough power. And some people are even devising that the powering can be due to mechanical contraction of heartbeat. So you amplify that and use that. So, so that's just mind-blowing as to how much, So, but the leadless pacemakers are the big advance, basically. So there's a lot of electronics that is involved. Okay, so now this is a very important thing. Okay, when the heart goes out of rhythm, it just becomes totally chaotic. Well, I explained to you about the atrial fibrillation, which can cause stroke, but at least you're living. And you feel lousy because the heart is out of sequence or beating fast and you need medicines for it, okay? But if the bottom chamber starts beating chaotically, you got 4 minutes, okay? Unless you start CPR, you're gone. So it's called ventricular fibrillation, which is the cause of death. And obviously, the Russians had done research on this about using electricity. This was done in the 19th century, but that literature did not translate. And then with the communism, we didn't trust the Russians. Okay, so it took several years. Finally, this research was duplicated in ~59 by a cardiologist out of Boston named Bernie Lone. Okay, they came up with the defibrillator paddles. So I'm sure you've all seen, at least on TV or in real life, the paddles where you shock the heart. And so this was a dramatic advance, but you had to devise how much energy to deliver, okay? Because you don't want to cause tissue damage or cause more heart attack. So you have to work out as to how many joules of energy, okay? That's why when you do the CPR, you have to make sure you start out low and then go to max, okay? So that's, that is one of the things that required a lot of, laboratory work, on animals and in human experimentation to come up with a defibrillator device, okay? And then a variety of waveforms as to whether we deliver a DC, direct current or alternating current, everything. So what type of waveform should be there, how to precisely deliver right amount of electricity without causing tissue damage, that required. Now, this, if all things, this is one of the most important slides that I can show you, okay? Okay, compression, airway, and breathing, okay? So the C word, basic CPR, so how many of you have taken basic CPR? Anybody? Okay, great, yeah, nice. Okay, so you're familiar with that, I shan't elaborate it. And this is the standard AED device, which is there at all major places where people would get together, okay? And this can be implanted inside the heart, okay? You can see the implantable cardiac defibrillator, okay? And that's saving lives, And now this is just a segue, I've worked in cardiology for 50 years, basically, so I followed, But at the same time, there was a well-known politician that you probably will be A+ if you remember. He lived through all these advances as a patient, okay? And he was the vice president of George Bush, a guy named Dick Cheney, okay? He had a heart attack at age 37, okay? And he went through all this, bypass surgeries, coronary stents, which we'll talk about in a little while. And at the same time, finally, he developed heart failure. He had heart transplant, and he just died at age 84. So he survived 50 years as a patient. I've lived through that as a physician. So I was just looking at, said, well, strange coincidence from, and in 1978, when he was 37, he had the heart attack. Okay, so that's one of the things. So, and let's see. Sorry, this is a top picture. Okay, and now the devices as to how to insert the device so that we don't have the wires, so how to deliver electricity. Because again, you put wires inside the heart, and this is not fun to get shock, okay? Believe me, because you get our patients will say, it feels like a mule kicked you, And I've had patients, oh, I don't want to live like this, doc, take it out, okay? So it really becomes a dilemma ethical dilemma as to who should we put the devices. It's easy to put one in, but it's not. If you have a lot of other multi-organ failure and you give device, it's not. It becomes a really moral dilemma to see who should we give devices. And the specialists recommend this, so that's just where it comes out with the fine line between the art of medicine versus science. But this is, okay. Now moving on further. Okay, we talked about heart valves, So before this thing, so this was in the 50s and 60s, a lot of people used to get narrowing of the heart valves, okay? And you may have heard of a guy named Charles Lindbergh, okay? The first guy who flew across the Atlantic, and his family member had heart narrowing. So he was interested in heart valve surgery. So he financed some of this research earlier about using heart-lung machine, okay? And it was done in like 1930s to see the heart-lung machine, okay? And it took a while for another 20 years for the technology to get perfected. At the same time, on the West Coast, people were thinking about putting in artificial valves, okay? And these were the earliest valves, ball and cage valve. Based on simple fluid dynamics, this type of, stylistic ball and cage valve were devised, And you can see this is a cloth and special material that is around the rim. Okay, where this was the earlier so-called ball cage valve that was done in the 60s in University of Oregon. Now, unfortunately, we didn't realize that nature does not like abnormal motion. So this ball valve were crushing your red blood cells like you're pounding on it. So people would get anemic, so you're becoming, so that was, the design was flawed design. We initially thought, oh, it would work, but so this valves lasted for a few years, but finally had to be. So then people came out with a tilting disc, like a yo-yo that you blow. You can just see the other one, the tilting disc valve. So this was the next stage of valves. Based on the flow, it's, you can see there is some serious metallurgy involved in it, okay, like a tilting disc valve. Now again, the metal, we didn't count on metal fatigue. So these valves were fracturing, and it was a nightmare to follow these people. All of a sudden, if this valve would, crack, you're in serious trouble and you need emergency surgery. So we had a lot of learning curve that you went through in the 70s with the valves, okay? And so this was, the early days of it was used with silicone and plastic, and the varieties of, big giants, Dow Chemical, and it required a lot of problems with the durability of the valves and learning how the flow works. Now, these valves are foreign tissues, so required blood thinner. So the French were smarter. They thought we could use organs from pigs. So they came up with, porcine valves, and these were, sterilized and, denatured, and these were pig valves that were devised by the French. You can see how this went, okay? And they were covered with natural tissue of, a cadaver pericardium, okay, and it was sewn inside the metal ring. And so this is what it looked like, okay. So this were the earlier, pig valves that were devised. But again, if you put it in when you're 30 years old, it's going to degenerate in 10, 15 years. So we need a second operation. So there is no such thing as a perfect lunch, okay. So we had a lot of learning curve with all these technologies, and it's still, things have improved, but still it's not like what Mother Nature made, okay. So we talked about the heart valve disease, okay. Sometimes, you learn with accident, okay. People were able to record pressures inside the heart by putting catheters, okay. But everybody was afraid. You can't inject contrast material dye inside tiny coronaries. Because of foreign material, the heart would get irritated and it would stop. Now, a cardiologist named Dr. Soanes was doing, measurements or angiography or recording pressure, and accidentally the tube went inside the coronaries. And surprise, surprise, the heart did stop or went out of rhythm, okay? And being an old-fashioned crutchy guy, he just said, "Cough, you SOB." And the patient coughed, and the heart rhythm went back to normal due to reflex rhythm. So the cough that changed the history. Then people realized that, yeah, it is possible to inject contrast material inside the tiny blood vessel called coronaries and record pictures. And that just opened the floodgates of finding out where the blockage was, okay? So the cough that changed the heart. Now again, we relied a lot on material science, okay? You can see it starting from rubber catheters which were used, earlier, to various material that was used to prevent like a tissue reaction. And the best alloy that people would come up with is called nitinol, N-I-T-I-N-O-L, which is nickel titanium alloy that came out of Navy, okay? It cannot be welded, but it is pliable material and it has reliable, technologies of flexibilities for human use, okay? So this was, and you can see that we again relied on a lot of engineering about the varieties of shapes of catheters, okay? Because, things are curved around, so it is not that easy to manipulate a little tube inside these arteries. So, but varieties of catheter shapes and preformed catheters were devised, and and this was one of the Nobel Prizes for devising this right catheters in angiography, okay? Preformed catheter, which has a loop like this. It just goes directly inside the arteries. And it takes a skilled technician, physician about 20 or 30 minutes to get pictures, of a beating heart from different views. You rotate from the right side, left side, from the bottom. So that's how okay. Another important side, we take credit, we have reduced the incidence of heart disease, but perhaps we are complimenting ourselves too much. The biggest reason why heart disease deaths have gone down was banning of cigarette smoking, and you recognize, the former president, Ronald Reagan, okay, doing commercials. And I've seen commercials, there was a cigarette, lucky, the cigarettes that doctors smoke, okay? And the study was done, smoking is harmful, as early as 1950. It took another 12 years for the Surgeon General to issue things about cigarette smoking is, so. And it took another 15 years to ban smoking in hospitals. I mean, this used to blow my mind. I used to have cancer specialists who would smoke cigarettes in the little side room and then go and tell the patient you should not smoke. I mean, it was just unreal. So it took a long time. And the power of Madison Avenue was substantial. They really had their, okay. And now this is, we talked about the fatty streak, and this is basic pathology 101, okay. And, you guys are not pre-med, so you don't worry too much about it. But this is when you're born. This is when you're 15, 20, if you're unlucky. And then the plaque progresses, and the endothelial cells, okay, and the cholesterol pack, the cheesy material takes. And when the plaque forms, then the blood stagnates, forms a clot, and when it ruptures, the plaque ruptures, that's when you get the heart attack. So it takes about 30, 40 years, okay? This was discovered on autopsy findings, but we didn't understand the physiology of it. Okay, we knew about cholesterol from Framingham study, but we didn't know how this metabolism was done. And liver was the master organ. So on liver, inside the liver, they're called LDL receptors. And it took, serious basic science to discover this, liver, binds the cholesterol and metabolizes effectively. So if you have, if you have less LDL receptors, that has a lot to do with your cholesterol. So the basic physiology, it took about 30, 40 years until 1980s to work out. That's why we had problems with treating heart disease, because we were treating, not treating the cause of the disease. We didn't have good medicines to lower cholesterol. Okay, so, and this was again worked out as far back as 1908, okay, again in Russia, okay, and then later on people fed high cholesterol rich food to rabbits and they got these plaques. So the basic science was gradually worked out, okay, and then finally we're putting links between the blood test abnormality and structural heart disease, okay. Okay. And this was one of the groundbreaking discovery that was again got a nod from the Nobel Committee, okay. And so this is basic biochemistry, and that I don't think we want to spend too much time on it for sake of time. Now some people are unlucky when you're born, okay. You can see this little child, this has a little things called xanthoma, that is cholesterol under the skin, because they have absolutely paucity of LDL receptors, okay. And this is like a 5-year-old who can have a cholesterol of as high as 500, okay. So it's a homozygous deficit in your gene, and that can cause so this is, and these kids or young men or even women would get heart attack in their 20s, okay. But now that is, fortunately, it is very rare, but the heterozygous inheritance is quite common. It may be as common as 1 in 500. So that's where you see the genetics, and the profiling can be useful, okay. And also, there is a protein called ApoE, and the ApoE protein, if they have abnormalities, they can also get early heart attack. And it's all how it is interconnected. It also has link with Alzheimer's disease. So how, so we are finally beginning to learn how. Now, as I talked about, earlier, we knew about cholesterol links from 1950s onwards, but we didn't have good treatment for it, okay. Now, this segues across the world to Japan. A guy named Akiro Endo, he was working for a Japanese, and they're looking for antibiotics, because most of the antibiotics come from fungus, okay. And he was working on penicillin mold, and unfortunately, that wasn't that effective, so the company put the plug on it, said, no, this is not worth pursuing. But he had noticed that this was also these people who were test subjects, they had lower cholesterol. So he thought this might be a rule for it, but the Sanyo, Japanese company, didn't pursue it. They sold the patent to a big US pharmaceutical called Merck, and they devised a drug to lower cholesterol, and that's the so-called statin drugs, okay. So there was a rise of how accidental discovery or observation from a good researcher led to this dramatic advance. And unfortunately, somewhere along the line, his work is not recognized. Now fungus have a lot to own. I'll just segue into it. People are looking for antibiotics all over the world. So a research organization had sent a ship to Easter Island. Okay, it's in the island in the middle of Pacific where they have those boas. Okay, and they collected a fungus from there. Again, they were saying you use it for antibiotic. Didn't work, but the researcher who is a pharmacologist, said, well, it does something with their immunity, so it cuts down their white blood cell count. So he didn't throw away the culture, okay? And finally that culture was used. Okay, when people started doing organ transplant, this came in as a handy to suppress immunity, okay? So, and now in the native language of Easter Island, it's called Rapa Nui, okay? So the drug is called rapamycin. And that just dramatically changed the anti-rejection therapy. And the same drug pharmacologically is called sirolimus. Now, we were talking about, when we talk about stent, I'll have more to say about it. So these varieties of fungi have made a dramatic this thing. So, okay. So, and the fungi name are academic, And this rapamycin is a dramatic molecule. In fact, it is used in one of the cellular pathways. It was totally new. It's called mTOR, a metabolic target of rapamycin. So if you take, basic biochemistry or cell signaling class, you'll run into called mTOR pathway. So it plays a dramatic role in immune rejection, and it also has benefit for longevity. So some people are taking it off label, some of these, Silicon Valley guys who want to live longer, okay, they're taking tons of vitamin and also taking rapamycin, okay, but that's, it still remains to be seen how they will plan out. And not only that, it has a role for fetal hemoglobin, okay. Some people have abnormalities called thalassemia, where you're familiar with sickle cell. There is some other hemoglobin defect that is called thalassemia. So by raising fetal hemoglobin, we can help these people. So it's a dramatic molecule. Okay. Now, a Time magazine was very popular, and this was, the two covers, cholesterol, bad news versus good news. Okay. So we went from one, in a span of 10 or 15 years, went from cholesterol is a big no-no to smiley, So I just thought that was kind of cute, Okay. And the earlier hypothesis, we thought we were, correlation is not causation. Okay. That's where we fell this thing on, because we thought, treat the numbers and everything would go. And as a physician, I used to always scratch my head. Why do these people get heart attack? Their cholesterol is 208, 208. Well, 200 is normal. Well, they shouldn't get massive blockages. No, it was just an enigma or a puzzle. Okay. And at the same time, people with cholesterol of 300 sometimes didn't get heart attack. Okay. I used to run what is called a cholesterol clinic in Green Bay, where I practice. And it was just mind-boggling. Does not compute, as to how they say. So, but it took a long time for us to see that human body is a lot more complex. It's not just a simple one molecule game. It's the whole homeostasis of physiology, relationship with obesity, insulin resistance, inflammation, all the things were correlated. And also this was based on observation studies, which were done with something called 7-country studies, because, we're able to measure what is measurable type of thing, So it's just like saying, all tall people are smart, but we are not measuring other parameters. So, that just, we fell into that trap basically, okay? And then, then the politics of food and low fat, okay? And then again, the advertising companies, the food industries, okay, you can eat this, there is no cholesterol, but at the same time it's loaded with sugar. And, it just, every time you see the box of Twinkies, okay, no cholesterol. Or sometimes even plant-based foods are labeled no cholesterol. I mean, does it make sense, to label it like this, and people are buying it off the shelf, and, and it didn't suppress your appetite, by not increasing enough protein. So it really went through a lot of soul searching, and so from 1970 onwards, we give a lot of advice about, okay, I used to advise people, you should have cereals and fruit juice, and this was a healthy breakfast. It's totally, because medicine is not science. I mean, I'm sorry, but it's more art. We make decisions based on the facts that are available. And, we're obviously, we were getting too simplistic. And finally, we put relationship with obesity. And then finally, now we are learning the role of inflammation. This is a rather busy side, but, you can, if you have time, you can read it. You cause injury to your inside of cells, either with stress, so smoking, diabetes, and we get oxidized LDL particles. And then your immune system comes into play, and the inflammation markers. Because in the old days, we're not able to measure these markers of inflammation. So this has been a big role to play of inflammation, immunity. So it's a three-ring circus that we're playing, okay? Yeah, I just thought you'll get a kick out of these acts. I mean, this is mind-blowing to me. It's like how doctors smoke Camels, and candy is good for the baby, give the baby 7-Up, okay? So these are legitimate ads from the 50s, okay? Okay, and the role of vagus nerves, we talked about vagus nerve, it has, it has dramatic benefit, Now this is another story. When we were residents, this was like a role of healing hand. Sometimes people get rapid heartbeat, which is irregular from top, bottom, like this, because you get a short circuit inside the middle conduction system called atrioventricular node. And if you're lucky, if you give massage on the neck, you could slow down the heart rate dramatically by reflex. Because remember, you put pressure on the carotid, you could faint, okay? I mean, not a good idea to do it, would be dumb, But we would look like heroes, you'd go to the emergency room, do a massage on the neck, heart rate slows down from 160 to 70. Oh, wow, what a brilliant doctor, Didn't work all the time, but worked, So that was, and now this has been magnified in vagus nerve stimulation. I'll have a slide for that later on. But finally, we are learning that you can say, well, we've heard about adrenaline, flight and fright response. Everybody knows that. Vagus is rest and digest, okay? So stimulating vagus nerves, that's why meditation works, you're calming down, okay? And a big role has been proposed for vagus nerve. Do you know what vagus means? Vagus means wanderer in Latin. So that's a nerve, one of the cranial nerves that comes out of your brain, and it goes everywhere, literally, from your eyes to your carotid to your gut. That's why there is a lot of relationship with your microbes and gut, okay? Okay, and this is, basically inflammation is a huge target for cholesterol, okay? And now not only that, we are learning the link of obesity, okay? That's why these new Ozempic-like drugs are being used, okay? I mean, that's the new kid. When are we supposed to stop? Oh, yeah, okay, so we have time. Okay, so that's what, yeah. So these drugs are not just for weight reduction, but people have, the drug companies sponsor a lot of trials, to increase amount of this market that they can share. So they're doing trials, and believe it or not, with their luck, and for a population of heart patients, the GLP-1 drugs do work with obesity and do reduce incidence of heart failure and heart death. So these trials have been very positive, and they work through the kidneys, obesity, and working on the inflammation mechanism. Okay, all right, I think okay, and so vagus nerve, you can just see this is outlined. What does vagus nerve do? Okay, so just by stimulating the vagus nerve, we have a dramatic effect on, heart, so physical activity, ischemic conditioning. So it has a dramatic role in terms of this. Now, at the same time, we thought like mechanical engineer, if there is blockage, one way to fix would be, to create new channel. So that 1967, we started doing bypass surgery. But again, we had great hopes for it. People would plug up in 10 years, okay? So a lot of times, because we're not addressing the basic metabolic problem, okay? So now at the same time, when the heart was damaged, putting new blood supply didn't do much good. So here was in 1967, a prima donna surgeon from South Africa did the first heart transplant, okay? And, his results were not that great, but he wanted to be the first around the block, okay? And didn't have the anti-rejection therapy, so it didn't work out too well. And it took further work by various heart surgeons in US who continued working with this, with preventing the immune complex reaction that the heart transplant. But again, we're limited by organ shortage, okay? Okay, revolution in treatment, okay? Now, again, we talked about the blockage due to cholesterol plaque and clot. So it became like a chicken versus egg, what came first, okay? And believe it or not, it took about 50 years to figure out what was first, whether the clot occurred after the heart attack or before. And because the autopsy was done, then some powerful pathologists No, the clot is after the fact. Okay, it's the plaque that is the blockage that's the problem. So we set things back for almost 50 years based on some powerful researchers, because it's a paradigm shift. It required dramatic shift in the thinking, how we could handle this. Okay, and so this is, when I heard about the clot dissolving medicine, it was a dramatic change as to how this clot, because again, we did not want to inject dye in the face of heart attack. And finally, some of the researchers were brave enough or foolish enough to do this. So then we can give clot dissolving medicine, varieties of enzymes, and that led to the rise of the most powerful genetic company called Genomics, okay, Genentech, okay. The two guys who, Boyer and Cohen, started a company with recombinant technology. So they came up with a drug called tissue plasminogen activator. If you look at the blood clot dissolving, there's a whole cascade of varieties of protein. So they came up with something called the tissue plasminogen activator, okay. And that was a dramatic change. You could dissolve the clot, and somebody would be wreathing with pain by dissolving the clot. Yeah, doc, I feel good. But again, the plaque remained. We dissolved the clot that is there, but the plaque remained. So that led to the next stage of putting in, metal coil inside called stent. And this was done in Switzerland. So there are varieties of ways. It's just like pushing, snow shoveling, pushing the snow along the side. Looks like a very crude technology, but the stents did work, okay? So that was, and in the 80s, those stents, actually we started putting a lot of surgeons out of business, okay? In fact, very few medical students want to be, do for cardiac thoracic surgery. It's a 7-year training, and still a lot of the work is taken over by cardiologists, okay? So there's, so if you have a friend in medical school, they may want to consider being cardiac surgeons, but there's a role for it, okay? Okay, and this is, okay. And then again, with organ transplant, the time is of essence, it has to be transported very quickly. So how to keep the heart beating outside in a box. So this is the big thing that extended oxygenation for organ care system has been devised called, this is literally called heart in the box, okay? So you can keep it harvested heart, so you can transport from New York to St. Louis type of thing. Because the time limit is like 90 minutes, because without adequate perfusion, okay, the tissue dies and you don't get good results, okay? So this is, a dramatic advance that had taken place. Now, people have been trying to work with artificial hearts for a long time, okay? Back in the 80s and 90s, people in Texas were devising, in fact, when I was in training in Louisville, the FDA had given permission for 6 artificial hearts, But again, the blood clotted and we had problems. So people lived for about 100 or a couple of 100 days, but it was a miserable thing. Finally, the French have this company called Carmet France that had devised a total artificial heart, okay? And this is a dramatic advance in, roughly weighs about 4 kilograms, a biocompatible material like a bovine, a pig or cow's pericardium for valves, internal surface, and it reduces the need for blood thinner. So this artificial heart is, finally they've been given permission to actually use it not as a bridge to transplant, but as a real replacement. So you're walking around with, unfortunately, they're having trouble with their finance. So it would be interesting to see as to how it flies out. It's just like the commercial ventures have a lot. So it has 2 ventricles, with electro-hydraulic pumps, with varieties of sensors that measure heart rate in real time. So it's a marvel of engineering type of thing, okay? And external battery packs. All you're doing is taking a battery pack that lasts several hours, okay? So it's really a dramatic change. Now, the other technology that we started using on the advance of Manhattan Project and isotope technology was nuclear cardiology. In fact, that's how the great Ernest Lawrence, who devised the big cyclotrons machines on the West Coast, got the funding. Oh, this is great for cancer. So that's how we got the funding. And the radioactive isotope waste product called technetium, okay? How good you know your chemistry? What's the atomic number of technetium? 43. And this was predicted by Mendeleev. Okay, he said this was like great imagination. This element should be there at this number. So he had predicted that, and it was discovered, several years later. That's why the name is called technetium. It's artificially made element. Okay, now that can, one of the isotopes of the technetium molybdenum, okay, which can be has a half-life of about 6 hours. It can be used for medical use. So that's the workhorse of nuclear cardiology. Okay, and we also used for a while isotope called thallium, but thallium is very toxic and wasn't, never really caught on very much. We did use thallium scan for scanning. Okay, and it took about 20 years for nuclear cardiology to find its testing, and these are some of the images. This alphabet soup, just so single photon emission computerized tomography. As you can see, the heart looks like and the way I used to explain, a donut is good, a bite out of a donut is not good. That's the area which has less blood supply. And this is done, first you do it at rest, then you make the person exercise on treadmill and inject at peak exercise. So the rest stress images. And that's how you can diagnose without having to put catheter inside the heart. And then along with that, a more sensitive isotope, positron emission tomography. Okay. Now this is used by, it's a lot more sophisticated images along with this, but it's just get a PET scan machine. It's frightfully expensive for any hospital. It costs like several $1,000,000. So it never caught on. The Anger camera is affordable to average hospital. And for just curiosity, there are differences, as to where it is generated, how much energy is used, what is the time sequence, okay, how quickly that is done, okay. So there are varieties of differences, pros and cons. So if you're a big medical center, if you already have PET scan, and this is one of the machines that were used by a cardiologist to show that the effect of diet and exercise actually reverse the heart disease, okay. And there were two cardiologists, two schools were arguing. One was a guy named Dr. Atkins. He was favoring the so-called paleo diet. And another guy was called Ornish, and who recommended strict vegetarian diet, meditation, so as to see which one was okay. Guess who won out? The guy who did the meditation and strict diet won out. Dr. Atkins, who recommended eating lobsters and steak, he died of heart attack. So this was an interesting controversies in cardiology that went on. Okay, now this is just a basic principle of how PET scanning works. Okay, it accumulates in positron emission. Okay, and with this you can get a functional capacity of actually we can measure the metabolism of the tissue. Okay, now and this is basic gamma camera, which just for sake of time, this was discovered back in 57. So you can just enter how gamma camera works and you'll be able to find it. Okay. I think now, and then we started using CAT scan. CAT scan was devised in 1960 primarily for brain. Okay. And that was, initially, it was relatively low resolution image. And as technology improved, we went from taking 2 hours for the imaging the brain to 3.5 minutes. Okay. And this is another way of looking for blockages. Plaques have calcium. So if you have risk factors such as high cholesterol, smoking, family history, you can get something called calcium score. And that gives us a little anatomical correlation as to how we can, who should we treat and who should not we treat. Because we can't hand out pills just willy-nilly. So this is how we can decide who is a good candidate for treatment and who is not. Okay. Okay, and basically that the gantry spins around. So I think we want to make sure we finish on time. So I think okay, and okay. So the machine fields and tomographic images are done around that. So okay, and this is what now you saw the earlier image of single slice, okay, which took 2 hours to acquire. This is the eye candy that you can see. Okay, the image is how dramatic it looks, color coded. Okay, this is worth showing. Okay, This is start spinning, okay. And it's acquired when the machine stops, the image is acquired, you can just see it will start spinning. Okay. Sorry, my sound is goofed up, but here's one image there. Yeah, this is what modern picture would look like. I mean, this is almost dramatic discovery of how, this was all acquired within 1.5 seconds. So you can just see how the details, like there's no reason to do autopsy. You already know what you're dealing with. So this has been a dramatic. I'm sorry, the sound is not playing because of the recording, but this is how the imaging is done. And in the same way, we again started using CAT scanning has radiation, so we adopted this MRI technology, magnetic resonance images, okay, where there is no radiation, but it's noisy as heck, okay, and it's claustrophobic. If you've ever had MRI, I know some people just can't stand it. You have to put them to sleep for it. And so these are the MRI images. Again, this is similar to ultrasound. So we have used this, and this can be used. And now the principle is, this magnet is about 60,000 more powerful than the Earth's magnet, and this, it's measured in Tesla coil, okay. And the hydrogen water body is 80% water, so hydrogen molecules spin, and with radio frequency you can measure the shift. That's how the MRI works. And MRI is a very popular thing. It has received about 6 Nobel Prizes. Okay, I'm not going to play the video for sounds. Okay, I think I have about. Okay, so you get the general idea about how this is how the north-south magnet. Okay, and then it stopped abruptly, and the image is processed. Okay. And with, there's a immense amount of math that is involved in looking the shift of the image that takes place. So the technology is just amazingly complex. So, and these MRI machines are again not cheap. They cost several $1 million. They're heavy, so that's why they're kept in the basement. And you could really get hurt if you have metal on you. It could fly up and can hurt somebody. So that's why if you have anything artificial like a pacemaker, you can't get MRI. Okay, so that's now this is angiography or stent. We talked about it, but you can just see how the metal coil is inserted, and all the plaque is pushed up. And the stent technology has expanded dramatically. Initially, the first generation stents were bare metal stents, but that developed scar tissue because Mother Nature didn't like what we were doing. So finally, people came up with something called drug-eluting stent. Remember, I talked about rapamycin. The pharmacological name is sirolimus. So the drug-coated stents have come out, and with that you can prevent the scar tissue. Okay. Again, you need blood thinners. So, but the stent technology is, and there are even balloons that are placed with the infiltrated particle-wise anti-rejection therapy. So this has been a dramatic change, and that initially we were very nervous. You could only do one vessel balloon angioplasty. Now people are dilating everything, So, and it is being abused also. A lot of time people chase anatomy rather than physiology. So there is a legit criticism that it's being overutilized. And a lot of metallurgy is involved in terms of steel, cobalt, various tons. So it's a big business, and some of the companies, Boston Scientific and other people. Okay, now, again, if you've had a heart attack, you need some artificial device, to help you with it. Okay, and in the early days, there were big balloon pumps, just like the pacemaker, that were put on the side. And there was engineering that would almost, a pump, the balloon would be placed inside the big blood vessel, and it would literally suck the blood out from a weak heart. So you're putting in something called balloon pumping, okay? It expands time with the diastole when the heart is relaxing, and it sucks the blood out of the heart. Now this has been finally improved dramatically, something called Impella external cardiac pulsing. You can see how thin this device is. You don't need this big bag that is sitting down, okay, and extends, type of thing. So, and this is one of the ways in which you can assist the heart in emptying when it is damaged. Okay. Now, what about genetic technology? It's like a wild goose chase. We have not been that successful in using gene therapy for heart because it's a very polygenic disease. Some people have used it for something called hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, which is a relatively small portion, for gene editing technology. Okay, but again, that the drugs and other treatments are available. So how that will go? Last but not the least, one group out of Mass General is trying to do genetic therapy for people who are born with high cholesterol, like those babies that I talked about. Okay, but that's still, a word or two about stem cells. Okay, again, it was a great hope for it, but it hasn't panned out. Okay, because heart muscle is fixed, so to speak. And Mother Nature has fixed the designs, doesn't like to change. So regeneration of heart, unless you're an axolotl, a little tiny this thing that can regenerate the heart, but we are not. So somewhere along the line, the evolution, we lost the ability to regenerate. Okay, I think I've covered, and there are various monitoring devices. I talked about vagus nerves, and you can have a stimulator inside the vagus nerve that is being used for heart failure. Okay. And we talked about regeneration. If you're a zebrafish, you can regenerate your heart. But again, we are mammals, not zebrafish. Okay. So I think, and there are, varieties of organoids that have been devised in the laboratory. They're useful, just like brain organoids that, that can play games. So the organoids have a huge benefit type thing. Okay, let me skip through a couple of other slides. Okay. And last but not the least, people are doing some meticulous work with xenotransplantation using pig hearts, but they have glycoproteins, so they can cause problems. There are varieties of viruses. This has been used for kidneys, but for heart, it's still further down the line. We had Valentine's Day, so this is the equation. Okay, so, and obviously, now these are the hormones that affect your love. Last but not the least, meditation, because, okay, not all questions can be answered. Okay, folks, we finished on time. Sorry and it was fun, and wish all of you the best with whatever field you're doing.